The men arrived at 7 in the morning. 2 of them. One with a clipboard and one with a padlock, and neither of them knocked. They simply opened the door with a master key and stood in the narrow entryway of apartment 4B at the Prentice Arms on the corner of Hargrove and Main in Millhaven, Montana, and told the woman sitting at her kitchen table, in her housecoat, with a cup of tea steaming in front of her and a birthday card from her granddaughter propped open beside it, that she had until 9 o'clock to be out. The woman did not scream. She did not cry. She set her teacup down on the saucer with the careful precision of someone who had survived harder mornings than this one, and she asked to see the paperwork. The man with the clipboard handed it to her. She read it once, very slowly. Then she set it down beside the birthday card. "I've lived in this apartment for 22 years, she said. The man with the clipboard looked at the wall above her head. "The order stands," he said. Downstairs, in the parking lot, a green pickup truck had just pulled in off the highway. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it until the very end. What happens in that apartment building will restore something you may have stopped believing in. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this story travels. Staff Sergeant Lucas Reed, retired, was 38 years old and had the kind of physical presence that rooms registered before people consciously decided to notice it. He was 6 feet and an inch, 210 pounds, with dark hair kept short by habit and a jaw that a decade of service had squared into something that suggested permanence. There was a scar along his left collarbone, barely visible above the collar of his flannel shirt, from a piece of glass during a vehicle rollover outside Kandahar in 2017 that he had never felt the need to discuss. His nose had been broken once, a training accident at Camp Lejeune that everyone involved agreed to call something else, and it had healed with a slight lean left that made his face look, in the right light, like it had been used for what faces were built for. His eyes were a cool, particular shade of blue-gray that people often described, without quite knowing why, as watchful. Not suspicious, watchful. The eyes of a man who had learned long ago that the world offered more information than most people bothered to collect, and who had decided early in his life to collect it. He had served 11 years with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, and a final tour in Syria that appeared in no public record. He'd come home from Syria with a chest full of decorations that included a Navy Commendation Medal with a combat fee, a combat action ribbon, and a recommendation for the Bronze Star that was still somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery when he submitted his papers. The nerve damage in his right knee had made the decision for him. He wasn't angry about it. He had served the time he had, and he had done the things that needed doing, and now he lived in a 2-bedroom rental house on the eastern edge of Millhaven, Montana. Population 4,100, and did contract work for a regional construction company 3 days a week. He was not unhappy. He had shadow. He was not a man who talked about feelings as a category. He was a man who showed up and fixed things. Shadow was a 6-year-old German shepherd, with a coat that ran the full spectrum from amber at the chest to near black along the spine and ears, thick enough that snowflakes rested on him for a full second before melting. He weighed 82 pounds. He was wide through the chest, long through the back, and moved with a particular controlled economy of an animal that had learned the difference between a situation that required readiness and one that required rest, and was never wrong about which was which. His right ear bore a notch at the tip, a clean crescent of missing cartilage from a fragmentation event outside Marja in 2019 that had also taken the tip of the handler before Shadow's current one, a fact that Shadow carried in his body as a kind of permanent orientation toward the people beside him. The scar had healed pale and clean. It looked Lucas had once thought, like a small moon. Shadow had been a military working dog with the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force for 5 years before Lucas had spent 8 months navigating the adoption program, calling numbers that went to voicemail, writing letters that went unanswered, and finally driving 14 hours to pick him up in person rather than trust the process to complete itself. Shadow had been in the passenger seat of Lucas's truck for 2 years and had not once given Lucas reason to doubt the effort. He moved when they walked together, at Lucas's left knee. Not behind, not ahead. Beside, Lucas had pulled into the Prentice Arms parking lot because he was doing a favor for his contractor, Ray Dominguez, who managed maintenance for the building, and who had called Lucas at 6:30 that morning to say that 2 men from Halverson Property Management had shown up with an eviction order and a locksmith, and Ray wasn't sure it was legal, and could Lucas come take a look, because Ray didn't know anything about that kind of paperwork, and also, he'd gotten to know the woman in 4B over the years and something felt wrong. Lucas had said he'd come. He didn't say anything else. He clipped Shadow's lead, got in the truck, and drove the 4 miles to Hargrove Street. The March air in Millhaven at 7:15 in the morning carried a cold that had a specific quality, not the killing cold of January, but the particular bitterness of a winter that is ending slowly and without apology. Lucas could see his breath. Shadow walked beside him with his ears forward and his tail level, and his eyes moving across the building's entrance with the systematic sweep that meant he was reading the scene and not yet finished. Ray met them at the lobby door. He was a broad, worried-looking man in his 50s who had the expression of someone who had seen something he couldn't account for and needed a second set of eyes to confirm it was real. "They're still up there," Ray said. "I told them I needed to verify the order. The one with the clipboard told me the verification window had passed. I don't know what that means." "Show me the order," Lucas said. Ray had a copy. Lucas read it on the walk to the elevator. It was a standard form Montana eviction notice from the Halverson Property Management Group, citing non-payment of rent and breach of lease terms, signed by a property manager named Clifton Rourke, and countersigned by the building's listed owner. The notice date was March 3rd. Today was March 9th. The order referenced a lease number and a tenant account in arrears of 3 months' rent. Shadow rode up in the elevator with his shoulder pressed lightly against Lucas's leg. He was not tense. He was present. There was a difference. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 92 years old. She had a small, straight-backed posture that she had maintained for 9 decades through 2 wars, a depression, the death of a husband, the raising of 3 children, and 34 years of teaching 5th grade at Millhaven Elementary School, where a hallway had been named after her in 1998. She was wearing a pale blue housecoat and slippers with a floral pattern, and her white hair was neatly pinned. On the kitchen table in front of her sat the birthday card, the eviction notice, and the teacup. She had stopped drinking the tea. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on the middle distance in the particular way of someone who is thinking through a problem with a great deal of discipline and a great deal of fear. She had taught school in this town for 34 years. She had buried her husband in the cemetery on Route 12. She had lived in this apartment, in this building, since the year her youngest son had moved to California, and she had decided that a smaller life was still a life. She paid her rent by automatic bank transfer on the 1st of every month. She had paid it that way for 22 years and had never once been late. She knew this to be a fact because she had a bank statement that said so, dated the morning of March 1st, 6 days ago, showing the transfer of her rent, $840, exactly as it had been for 7 years, from her checking account to the Prentice Arms property account. She had printed the statement and set it on the table next to the eviction notice. Clifton Rourke was 29 years old, the nephew of the building's actual owner, a man named Gerald Halverson, who had retired to Scottsdale and who had handed the property management operation to his nephew 18 months ago, in a decision he had since stopped examining closely. Clifton Rourke wore a North Face vest and a wireless earpiece and carried himself with the assurance of someone who had recently discovered that authority was available for the taking, and had decided to take as much of it as possible before someone checked the paperwork. He had been evicting residents of 4 Halverson buildings across western Montana for the past 7 months in what he had explained to Gerald over the phone as a portfolio optimization. Older tenants on older leases at older rates, replaced by younger tenants at current market rates. The math was simple. The process was fast. Nobody had stopped him yet. The lease on 4B at $840 a month was the oldest and cheapest in the building. Clifton Rourke needed it at $1,200. He had generated the eviction notice himself using a template and had backdated the account in arrears entry. He had done this 4 times in 7 months. Each previous tenant had been in their 70s or 80s, living alone, and had left with varying degrees of confusion, distress, and no forwarding attorney. Eleanor Marsh was 92, and it was her birthday, and Clifton Rourke had considered this information and had decided it was not relevant to the process. He was standing at the window of 4B when Lucas knocked on the open door. Shadow stood at Lucas's left knee. The man with the padlock was near the bathroom door. He saw the dog first and took a half step back. "Building maintenance," Clifton said, turning from the window. He was already reconstructing his authority before Lucas had crossed the threshold. "This is an active eviction proceeding. You need to leave." "I'm with building maintenance," Lucas said. He looked past Clifton to Eleanor Marsh, who had turned in her chair and was watching him with her hands still folded in her lap, and an expression that was not hope so much as a trained suspension of expectation, the look of a woman who had learned that hope without evidence was a tax on the spirit. "Ma'am, I'm Lucas Reed. Ray called me. Can I ask you a couple of questions before anything else happens?" She nodded once. Shadow's ears rotated. He moved his gaze to Clifton Rourke and held it there. Lucas spent 4 minutes at Eleanor Marsh's kitchen table. He looked at the eviction notice. He looked at the bank statement she had printed. He looked at the lease number on the notice, and the lease number on her copy of the original tenant agreement, which she had kept in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer for 22 years. Because she was the kind of woman who kept things in their proper place. The lease numbers did not match. They were close transposed digits, a difference of 2 characters, but they did not match. The account number cited in the arrears notice was not Eleanor Marsh's account. Someone had generated a notice against a lease number that did not exist in this apartment. Clifton Rourke said, "Whatever you think you're finding, the order is valid, and the process is legal, and you are not authorized to be in this unit." Lucas set the papers down on the table and looked at Clifton Rourke with the particular stillness that 11 years of service had built into him. Not aggression, not performance. The complete, considered absence of anything that could be called hurry. "The lease number on this notice," Lucas said, "doesn't match the lease on file for this tenant. The account in arrears is not this tenant's account. The rent transfer for March 1st is on her bank statement with a confirmation number. What I'm finding is that someone fabricated a document." Clifton's expression cycled through several things quickly. "That's a serious accusation. It's a description of what's in front of me." Lucas picked up his phone. He made a call. He did not step away or lower his voice. He asked for Deputy Cassandra Vance at the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office, who had been in the same volunteer fire brigade as Lucas for the past year, and who picked up in 2 rings. He told her what he was looking at. He gave her the lease numbers side by side. He gave her Clifton Rourke's name and Halverson Property Management and the address. He gave her 3 previous addresses Ray had found in the building's records where similar evictions had been processed in the past 7 months. He did this in the same tone he would have used to read grid coordinates. When he ended the call, he turned back to Clifton Rourke. "Deputies on her way," Lucas said. 30 minutes. I'd suggest you don't leave the building." Clifton Rourke was already reaching for his phone. His voice had changed register. The wireless earpiece had come out of his ear and was in his hand. "My uncle owns this building. You understand that. Gerald Halverson. He will hear about this. You will be hearing from our legal team by end of day." "That's fine," Lucas said. Shadow had not moved from his position at Lucas's knee. He was watching Clifton Rourke with the concentrated, patient attention of an animal that has correctly identified the nature of a situation and is simply waiting for the situation to conclude. His hackles had not risen. He did not growl. He simply watched, with the kind of certainty that did not require demonstration. Clifton looked at the dog. Something in Clifton's bearing shifted. Not much, but measurably. "What is wrong with that animal?" Clifton said. "Nothing," Lucas said. "He's doing his job." Eleanor Marsh, at the kitchen table, had picked up the birthday card. She was holding it with both hands. She was reading it again. Lucas watched her for a moment. The straightness of her spine, the particular dignity with which she held herself in a housecoat in her own kitchen on the morning of her birthday with 2 strangers who had come to take her home. And he felt something settle in him that was not calm, but was close to it. The particular quality of resolve that arrives when the situation is understood completely. Ray Dominguez came up the stairs with a folder of lease records he had pulled from the building management system. He spread them on the kitchen table. In the records for 7 of the past 8 months, lease number entries for 3 previous tenants showed the same 2-digit transposition pattern as the notice against Eleanor Marsh. The building's actual lease numbering system used sequential 4-digit codes. The fraudulent eviction notices all used the same structural error. The 3rd and 4th digits switched. Someone had written a template once and copied it 7 times without checking the source numbers. Outside the building, in the parking lot, 2 men in suits arrived in a silver sedan 40 minutes before Deputy Vance's cruiser. They were attorneys from a firm in Billings who represented Halverson Property Management and who had apparently been called by Clifton in the 12 minutes between Lucas's phone call and their departure from the office, which suggested they had been on some kind of standby. The younger one came upstairs first and asked to speak with Clifton privately. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. When Clifton came out of the hallway, his face had the look of a man who had received information he was not prepared to receive. Deputy Vance arrived with a second car. She stood in the kitchen of 4B and read the documents that Lucas and Ray had laid out and asked several questions and made several calls of her. Owen and then told Clifton Rourke that she was asking him to remain available for questioning in connection with a potential fraudulent document investigation and that she was contacting the Montana Department of Justice Tenant Protection Unit, which had jurisdiction over exactly this kind of organized lease fraud. She said this quietly and without drama. Clifton Rourke sat down in the chair by the window that he had been standing in front of when Lucas arrived. He did not say anything. Eleanor Marsh asked Deputy Vance if she could make a fresh pot of tea. Deputy Vance said yes. At one point in the hour that followed, Shadow walked to where Eleanor Marsh was standing at the kitchen counter and sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder was touching her leg, and stayed there. Eleanor looked down at him. She put one hand on top of his head, lightly. The way you touch something you're not sure you have permission to touch, but that you've needed to touch for a long time. Shadow did not move. "He's a veteran," Lucas said from across the room, and Eleanor Marsh nodded as if she had already known this. What followed was not quick, but it was thorough. The Montana Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into Halverson Property Management within 72 hours of Deputy Vance's report. The investigation identified 6 confirmed fraudulent eviction notices across 4 buildings in 3 counties over a span of 11 months. 3 of the previous tenants, all of them elderly, all of them living alone, had vacated without legal challenge, displaced from homes they had occupied for between 9 and 26 years. Clifton Rourke was charged in April with 6 counts of fraudulent misrepresentation and 1 count of elder financial exploitation, a felony under Montana statute. His uncle, Gerald Halverson, initially cooperative, was subsequently charged with a single count of negligent supervision after investigators determined he had received copies of the eviction documentation and had failed to review them. The Halverson portfolio was placed in receivership pending resolution of the case. Clifton Rourke entered a guilty plea to 4 of the 6 counts in September. He was sentenced to 26 months and ordered to pay restitution totaling $81,000 to be divided among the displaced tenants. His uncle's charge was resolved with a fine and a 5-year bar from property management operations in the state of Montana. 6 months after the morning in 4B, Eleanor Marsh sat on the small balcony of her apartment in the early September sun with a cup of tea and a new birthday card. This one early, from a former student, sent to the building's address, which was still her address because she had not gone anywhere. Her rent had been adjusted, under the terms of a settlement agreement, to remain at $840 for the duration of her tenancy, a term defined in the agreement as her lifetime. Below, in the parking lot, a green pickup truck pulled in off Hargrove Street. Shadow came up the stairs ahead of Lucas and pushed open the door that Eleanor had taken to leaving unlatched on the first Saturday of each month, and crossed the apartment to the balcony door and sat down beside her chair and put his head on her knee and waited. Lucas came up behind him with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Main Street that Eleanor had told him she preferred, and set one on the balcony railing in front of her. "How's the knee?" she asked, the way she always asked. "Same," he said, the way he always said. They sat in the September light, the 3 of them, while Shadow watched the parking lot below with his ears forward and his tail moving slowly back and forth, and Lucas drank his coffee and did not say much, and Eleanor Marsh held her tea with both hands and looked at the mountains past the edge of town and did not need anything explained to her about why the world sometimes sent people through. The right door at the right time. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or dramatic declaration. Sometimes they pull into a parking lot at 7 in the morning because a maintenance man made a worried phone call, and a man and his dog came without being asked twice. God does not always send rescue in the forms we expect, or at the moments we think we've earned it. He sends it through people who show up, who read the paperwork, who know the difference between a process and a lie, and who stay until the matter is resolved. Eleanor Marsh had lived 92 years building a life worth protecting. She had taught children, buried a husband, paid her rent on the 1st of every month for 22 years, and held herself with dignity in a blue housecoat while 2 strangers told her to leave. She deserved someone to show up. In the end, someone did. That is not an accident. That is the kind of grace that moves through ordinary people who have chosen, each day, not to drive past the thing that is wrong. Loyalty does not expire. Service does not end with a discharge. And the truth, patient, documentable, plain as transposed digits on a forged lease, has a way of outlasting every person who believed they could bury it in a clipboard and a padlock. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth still matters and that ordinary people still fight for it. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and if you've ever known someone who stood up for a neighbor when no one else would. We'd love to hear that story too. Your words may be the light someone else needs today. If you believe in courage, in service, and in the kind of loyalty that walks on 4 legs as easily as 2, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you safely through whatever season of life you are walking through tonight. And may you always have the courage to knock on the door that needs knocking.